at Slate, there is a desire to make people move a little differently. We are adventure seekers, record breakers, and trendsetters. We learn from the best. We innovate, lead. We inspire. We are here to change the world. Slate, a tradition of excellence. Here at Slate, there is a desire to make people move a little differently. We are adventure seekers, record breakers, and trendsetters. We learn from the best. We innovate, lead. We inspire. We are here to change the world. Slate, a tradition of excellence. At Slate, there is a desire to make people move a little differently. We are adventure seekers, record breakers, and trendsetters. We learn from the best. We innovate, lead. We inspire. We are here to change the world. Slate, a tradition of excellence.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Olcott Oration 2020, organized by the Ananda College Old Boys Association. Our distinguished chief guest and orator for this evening is currently being welcomed into the premises of Ananda College, quite specifically the famous Madamidula, followed by them being welcomed into the PDS Puraratna Auditorium by the Principal, Executive President and Executive Committee of the Old Boys Association, along with other dignified guests of honor. For anyone who's unable to join us this evening in person, the organizing committee has made arrangements to stream the entire event live via YouTube and Facebook. The live stream is currently available for viewing on the Old Boys Association's YouTube channel and Facebook page. We'd like everyone to spread the word and get as many people as possible to join in on the live stream, especially for those who are unable to be here with us this evening in person. This evening's oration will be delivered by distinguished old Anandian, Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, founder and chief executive officer of TWC Private Limited, on the ideal topic and timely topic of bridging the ideological divide that caused Sri Lanka's economic crisis. like to begin this evening's proceedings with the traditional lighting of the oil lamp. For this, may I most kindly invite the principal of Ananda College, Mr. Lal Disanayake. Orator and chief guest, distinguished old Anandian, founder and CEO of TW Corp Private Limited, Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe. Deputy Principals, Mr. Sumit Madhulinga and Mr. Randika Pereira. Executive President of the Old Boys Association, Mr. Bimal Wijesinghe. Deputy President, Professor Olcott Oration. Joint Secretaries, Mr. Steel Olcott and Mr. Yasas Hariran. Treasurer, Mr. Thilan. Chairman of the Olcott Oration Organizing Committee, Mr. Samita Seniviratne. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'd also like to make special mentions of two contributors for this year's Olcott Oration, Slit and Mulberry Apartments, whose generous contribution and support have immensely helped the organizing committee in bringing together this year's Olcott Oration. Our distinguished gathering will now be welcomed inside the auditorium in a ceremonial procession by the Kandyan dancers. May I most kindly request the principal of Ananda College, Mr. Lal Disanayake, orator and chief guest, Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, executive president of the Old Boys Association, Mr. Bimal Wijesinghe, and chairman of the Olcott Oration 2022 organizing committee, Mr. Samita Seniviratne, to take their seats on stage. I would like to ask all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to please rise for the national and college anthems.
Siri Varini, Surati Ati
If I may, ladies and gentlemen, ask you all to remain standing to pay respect to our founders and war heroes and to all those who have passed away and are now in our memories and whose contribution to Ananda has made it what it is today by observing 1 minute of silence. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would now like to invite Venerable Hindikiule Panyasara Thera to observe Pansil upon this forum and invoke the blessings of the Noble Triple Gem.
හොඳයි සියලු දෙනා নমස්කාරය තෙවරක් කියන්න පන්සිල් සමාදන් වීම සඳහා. බුද්ධං සරණං ගච්ඡාමි ධම්මං සරණං ගච්ඡාමි සංඝං සරණං ගච්ඡාමි ဒုတိယံ පි බුද්ධං සරණං ගච්ඡාමි Dutiyampi dhammang saranang gacchami Dutiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami Tatiyampi buddhang saranang gacchami Tatiyampi dhammang saranang gacchami Tatiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami Panatipata veramani sikkhapadan samadhiyami Adinādāna veramani sikkhapadan samadhiyami කාමේසු මිච්ඡාචාරා වේරමණී සික්ඛාපදං සමාදියාමි. මුසාවාදා වේරමණී සික්ඛාපදං සමාදියාමි. සුරාමේරේ මජ්ජපමා දට්ඨානා වේරමණී සික්ඛාපදං සමාදියාමි. හොඳයි, මේ අවස්ථාවේදී උත්සව සභාවේ සියලු කාර්යයන් සාර්ථකව හොඳින් සිදු කරගෙන යාම සඳහා තුනුරුවනේ ආශිර්වාදේ ප්‍රාර්ථනා කරමින් ආශිර්වාද ගාථා සජ්ජායනය කරනු ලබනවා. වන්දනා කරන්න. භවතු සබ්බ මංගලං රක්ඛන්තු සබ්බ දේවතා සබ්බ බුද්ධානුභාවේන සදා සුක්ති භවන්තු තේ අභිවාදන සීලිස්ස නිච්ඡං වද්ධාපචා ආරෝ ධම්මා වඩ්ඩන්ති ආයුවන්නෝ සුඛං බලං ආයුරාෝග්‍ය සම්පatti සග්ග සම්පatti මේවච අතෝ නිබ්බාන සම්පatti මිනාතේ සමිජ්ජතු. සියලු දෙනාට
අවසරයි ස්වාමින් වහන්සේ. Ladies and gentlemen, you may now take your seats. On to the left of the stage are three portraits of key figures who have been instrumental for the sustenance of the Buddhist revival movement in the then CEYLON, and in every possible way who gave their life for the continuation of Buddhist education through Ananda and other means necessary. It is our duty, ladies and gentlemen, to pay respect and homage to our ancestors who stood for what they believed in, which is why I'd like to kindly invite our chief guest and orator, Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, to garland the portrait of our founder, Colonel Henry Steel Olcott, Principal Mr. Lal Disanayaka to garland the portrait of Venerable Migettuwatte Gunananda Thera, and Executive President of the Old Boys Association, Mr. Bimal Wijesinghe, to garland that of Venerable Hikkaduwe Sri Sumangala Thera. Thank you, gentlemen. And now, please direct your attention onto the LED screen, as this is a glimpse into the life of our founder, Colonel Henry Steel Olcott.
Colonel Henry Steel Olcott is an important Sri Lankan national hero and is perhaps the most important of such heroes who was born overseas. Colonel Henry Steel Olcott was born in 1832 in the United States. A journalist and a lawyer, Colonel Olcott achieved early distinction as an officer in the U.S. Army during the American Civil War, which was fought from 1861 to 1865, achieving emancipation of the slaves in the United States. He served in several important military and governmental roles in the course of his career. The Panadura Vadaya, or the Panadura debate, was instrumental in Colonel Olcott visiting Sri Lanka. Colonel Henry Steel Olcott co-founded the Theosophical Society in 1875, along with Ms. Helena Blavatsky and others. They transferred the headquarters of the society to India in 1878. Colonel Olcott and Ms. Blavatsky reached Colombo in 1880 and observed the Panchasila upon their arrival. At a time when the practice of Buddhism in the country was under serious threat, Colonel Olcott, along with his colleagues, instituted important measures to stem the deadline. Establishment of a network of Buddhist schools under the Buddhist Theosophical Society was of paramount importance. The network of schools include Ananda College, Colombo, Dharmaraja College, Kandy, and Mahendra College, Gaul. The Buddhist Theosophical Society schools had an uphill battle to fight for a long time, having to compete against the well-established missionary and British-controlled educational institutions of the time, whilst receiving no support from the establishment. However, the Buddhist schools established under the Buddhist Theosophical Society thrived, while also being a foundational element, the Buddhist revival in Sri Lanka. The Buddhist revival, in turn, was of paramount importance in the success of the independence movement. Colonel Olcott passed away in 1907 in Adyar, Chennai. The Buddhist revival in Sri Lanka played an important role in Buddhism, continuing to thrive in Sri Lanka despite many challenges, was also contributing substantially to the realization of independence for the country. Colonel Henry Steel Olcott played a very important role in the Buddhist revival. He is one of Sri Lanka's most important heroes and should be recognized as a key figure in the strengthening of Buddhism worldwide. Such was his enduring influence.
Once again, the very best of evenings to you, ladies and gentlemen, and greetings to all joining with us this evening virtually via YouTube and Facebook on the live stream. It's a pleasure to have all of you here with us this evening. I'm Thilan, and I will be your MC tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, our beautiful country, our Sri Lanka, is known for having perhaps one of the richest and vibrant cultures in this world. Our heritage, coming down from the days of kings and queens, is something possibly incomparable with any other country. But our country is also known for years of struggle through decades of colonization, political turmoil, war. The period post-independence laid the foundation for much of the volatility we see today in terms of socio-economic and socio-political spheres. And through all these years of turbulence, generations of our Sri Lankans have endured a catastrophic tsunami, a civil war, a recession, COVID-19, and today, the worst socio-economic crisis to have engulfed our country. So you see, through all this, ladies and gentlemen, we have shown our grit, our resilience, and our steadfast against forces, no matter the circumstances. If I take you back in time to the days of the then CEYLON, our country was still very much in turmoil. This is the parallel I'd like to draw today. This constant volatility has been a part of our lives since time immemorial, but it's just that this time we actually felt it. If we are to compare the two times, ladies and gentlemen, our ancestors faced similar hardships. They were a generation that was marginalized for standing up for something they believed in. The sense of patriotism embedded in our ancestors is perhaps the reason why we still have a home called Sri Lanka. Collectively, they stood against the clutches of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, to ensure the survival of Buddhism so that their children and children's children, we would carry their legacy. During such a time, it took one man to pull together a nation in disarray. one man's vision to decide the very trajectory in which this country would go. It took one man, ladies and gentlemen, to flock together the people of a nation that had lost hope. Colonel Henry Steel Olcott. Had he not taken a step towards the revival of Buddhism, none of this would have been a reality. Through independence and the decades that came after, Sri Lanka was a developing nation. This is something I want you to think about. From 1948 through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Sri Lanka has been considered as a developing nation. It's 2022 now. Next year we celebrate 75 years of independence, ladies and gentlemen. And still, Sri Lanka is a developing nation. Back then, Ananda was the beacon of hope everyone wanted. This right here, our home, was the reason why people set their differences aside and came together to work towards one common goal: independence. This right here is what we need today, ladies and gentlemen. Now more than ever, at a time when our country, when hope for our country seems lost, when there's little to no belief in this country, in our people, in each other, now is when we need to come together as one people. For 14 years, Ananda has been my home. It was Ananda that taught me the power of belief, but more importantly, the power of belief when all of us come together to work for a common goal, to help one another, to be there for one another. That's what Ananda taught me. And that may very well have been the wisdom that Colonel Henry Steel Olcott would have wanted his students, generations down the line, to learn and depart on the forthcoming generations. If 37 students could lay the foundation for change in this country, there's absolutely no reason why you and I can't take one small step to change our country and the country's course for the future. That's why I believe courage is what we need right now, ladies and gentlemen. Courage to do all that is necessary for the survival of our country, our people, and our children. That is what Ananda would want you to do, and that is what Colonel Henry Steel Olcott would want from all of us. Once again, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Olcott Oration. And now, to extend a more formal welcome this evening, I'd like to invite the Executive President of the Ananda College Old Boys Association, Mr. Bimal Wijesinghe.
Good evening. Venerable Mahasangha, Principal of Ananda College, Mr. Lal Disanayaka, Deputy Principals, Assistant Principals, Member of the Academic Staff of Ananda College, Past Presidents, Management Committee and Executive Committee members of the Ananda College All Boys Association, Ambassadors, High Commissioners, distinguished invitees present here, fellow Anandians, well-wishers, attendees connecting virtually from all over the world to be part of the Colonel Henry Steel Olcott Memorial Oration 2022. The Old Boys Association of Ananda College annually organized the Olcott Oration to commemorate efforts of Henry Steel Olcott. We are very grateful towards Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe for humbly accepting our invitation and being present here today to deliver this year's edition of Olcott Oration. Thilan is a prominent old Anandian, financier, entrepreneur, former cricketer, and musician, and currently he is the chairman of TWC Corporation. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Colonel Henry Steel Olcott Memorial Oration 2022. With the profound history of 136 years, Ananda College has been able to produce many great personalities to the country and the whole wide world. And this event is organized to commemorate the efforts made by our founders back in the 1880s, who took a leading role in establishing Buddhist single education in the country. We shouldn't forget the untiring efforts of the Mahasangha in this mammoth task. Ananda College is a result of culmination of events and efforts exerted by a many number of individuals headed by Venerable Hikkaduwe Sri Sumangala Thero, Venerable Migettuwatte Gunananda Thero. They, along with the American Theosophist Colonel Henry Steel Olcott, who traveled across the world and to Sri Lanka to make a transformation in the country. In it, the involvement of the trio had a major impact on the education for Buddhists, and after centuries down the line, Mother Ananda has been able to gift many prominent personalities to the nation. Be it politics, sports, academics, law and order, finance, administration, military forces, corporate, Anandians has excelled into a top positions and steered this country into the new dimensions. We are indeed in debt for our bold founders for their immense contribution which has carried this country a long way. We are very grateful for Colonel Henry Steel Olcott for the service rendered to instill a good culture of Buddhist education in Sri Lanka. Being an American, Olcott was born on the 2nd of August 1832 in Orange, New Jersey. He served as a military officer, journalist, and lawyer, while becoming the co-founder and the first president of the Theosophical Society in the year 1875. Colonel Henry Steel Olcott arrived at Sri Lanka on the 16th May 1880, where he immensely contributed to establishing Ananda College in 1886, followed by Dharmaraja College, Kandy in 1887, Maliyadeva College, Kunnagala in 1888, as well as Gampa Siddhartha Kumara Vidyalaya in 1891 and Mahinda College, Gaul in 1892. We shouldn't forget that in 1925, Nalanda College, Museus College, Dharmasoga College, Ambalangoda, two were established under the movement guided by Henry Steel Olcott. Out of all the work of Olcott, serving as an advisor to the committee appointed to design the Buddhist flag in 1885, was embraced by many Buddhists all over the world. Colonel Henry Steel Olcott passed away, leaving a great legacy behind on the 17th of February 1907. Even at that point, he was serving as the president of the most prestigious Theosophical Society. In order to serve the world with even better purpose while continuing the legacy of our founders, the Olcott Oration was inaugurated back in 1968 and was relaunched in 2001 after a long break of over 3 decades. At this very special commemoration event, we indeed need to reminisce the invaluable services rendered by Venerable Hikkaduwe Sri Sumangala Thero, Venerable Migettuwatte Gunananda Thero, along with Anagarika Dharmapala, who nurtured the culture of education of Buddhists, which has sheltered millions of children for the past centuries. We are truly in debt for these personalities who fought against the barriers and challenges put up against the Buddhists, and we are immensely grateful for the freedom that was gifted to us by these heroes who always fought with the dream of unifying this country. Even though it's not my duty to introduce our orator for the evening, yet it is my responsibility to pay due respect to him for accepting our invitation amidst his busy schedule to share some significant information related to the current economic context. Personally, knowing our resource person, I am sure that we will not have any dull second this evening. Chairman of TWC Corporation, Thilan Wijesinghe, thank you very much for your consideration, time and energy dedicated for this year's Olcott Oration. I am proud that you will now be joining the elite list of the orators who had the luxury of addressing this distinguished audience. We are humbly proud for being able to conduct this prestigious event on a hybrid mechanism for third consecutive year, paving an opportunity for many enthusiasts to join us live from every corner of the world, which wasn't a privilege in the past. A special gratitude to all the viewers connecting via online platforms. We hope we will be able to have this event in large scale in the coming years, upholding ultimate objective of commemorating and fellowship, which are two of the main objectives of the subcommittee led by Vice President Samita Seneviratne. I take this opportunity to thank the entire committee for their untiring efforts in organizing this event at a very challenging period. Without any further ado, I would conclude my welcome, inviting you all to enjoy today's oration. May the blessings of Mother Ananda shower upon you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bimal Wijesinghe. The next person I am about to invite on stage has been vested with the responsibility of introducing our orator this evening. But first, allow me to take a few minutes to introduce this next gentleman. He began his time here at Ananda in 1958 when he entered as a student in grade 4. And he has been at Ananda till 1969. He exemplified in athletics, tennis, but most importantly, cricket. This was in parallel or in conjunction to his exceptional talent in studies as well. He captained the Ananda First 11 team in 1969. And in fact, he was a very young captain at the time when he was just 15 plus years old. Most importantly, he won the most prestigious award up for grabs for any student at Ananda, the Fritz Koons Memorial Challenge Trophy, awarded to the most outstanding Anandian during a year. And he won this as a joint winner with Professor Sudarshan Seneviratne, also an old Anandian. Following which, he took his education to the University of Moratuwa, then to King's College London and to Imperial College London for his bachelor's and master's, and from Imperial College London he graduated with a Master of Science in Communication Engineering. Right now he serves as a director at Hema's Pharmaceuticals and has also served in various capacities across Sampath Bank, Asian Hotels and Properties, again Hema's and the University of Moratuwa. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage distinguished old Anandian himself, Mr. Sanjeeva Senanayaka.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me first recognize the principal, Mr. Lal Disanayaka, vice principals, teachers, past and present, distinguished office bearers of the OBA, quite a few here I think, and ladies and gentlemen, those who are attending this annual prestigious event. My task today is to introduce an illustrious product of Ananda, Thilan Wijesinghe. I will focus on his main achievements and attributes, since the introduction might otherwise take longer than the oration. There's a whole lot of achievements on his side. Thilan was about 10 years younger than me in school, and he played cricket as well, so we have a lot of affinities in that sense. I knew his father well. He's a good example of the type of Anandian that our founders intended to produce. These are men who are broad in education and outlook, progressive, and closely bonded with the country, with Sri Lanka. That is the main difference, not those who have looked down on our capabilities and our history. Our school motto, for instance, Appamado Amatapadam, which means, it of course is a religious statement. Still, it encourages us to a life of purposeful action, immediate action, not delaying and procrastinating, and it's towards meaningful goals. So I think Thilan exemplifies that. His father, the late Tilak Wijesinghe, who I said I knew well, and Dr. B.M.A. Balasurya, who was also a very well-known Anandian, both very devoted to the college, and distinguished professional engineers, I'm sure would have influenced his way of thinking. Thilan joined in 1965, grade 1. That's the year I started playing cricket. So he had his entire education up to 1979 thereafter at Ananda, and he was obviously quite good in his academic studies, and he was the first Anandian to be awarded an American Field Service Scholarship. Later he received a full scholarship, and then he started his tertiary education at the State University of New York, and later at Cornell University, where he graduated with a BSc in Industrial Engineering and a BA in Economics and a BSc in Business Administration as well. As I said before, Thilan was better known in his school days for his cricket, and I should mention something about that. In 1973, he was age 13 when he played for a full season for Ananda, which is the record that age. And he has a unique record also of having played that year for the under 14, the under 16, and the first 11 teams in one calendar year. Then he played for Tamil Union club, which was a Division 1 club, while he was in school. And 2 years later, he was still 15, he became the youngest to score a century in the Division 1 tournament. In 1976 was another big year. He scored 104 in the big match. First time a century had been scored in 44 years by Ananda, and the highest score by an Anandian at the time. He was selected best schoolboy batsman and was the youngest player in the Sri Lanka under-19 team that toured in 1976. Toured Pakistan, sorry. Then he captained Ananda in 1979 and set a record for the highest aggregate number of runs in all Ananda-Nalanda matches, including the 50 overs games. He has many more achievements in cricket, in fact, but I think I'll have to cut short somewhere. He captained the Tamil Union Cricket Club in 91, for instance, and became the best batsman in Division 1 cricket, which is very competitive at the time. And he also captained the Sri Lanka A team in 1991-92. Thilan has other talents, obviously. He has a talent in music, and he plays the piano. He says he started playing professionally while he was studying in America at a restaurant to make pocket money, I guess. He also plays the guitar and harmonica in addition to singing, and he has composed music, and he has also appeared as a guest musician in many charity concerts up to 2008. Getting on to his professional life, after he returned from the USA in 1984, he started his working life with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I'm sure Deva knows about that. And in 1989, he joined Sampath Bank. He was there for 3 years, and he left as a manager of strategic planning. When he left Sampath, he had obviously ambitions of doing something for himself, and he was co-founder and executive director of Asia Capital, which was at that time one of the largest investment banks operating in Sri Lanka. It was actually new actually. So there was Asia Capital and Asia Stockbrokers. Thilan was closely involved in landmark transactions such as privatization of what is now called the Cinnamon Grand and the Cinnamon Lakeside. In September 1995, he was invited by the government to become the youngest ever chairman of the Board of Investment, and that I'm sure most of you will remember. And then, of course, he sold his shares in Asia Capital to concentrate as a government servant effectively. At the BOI, he also pioneered public-private partnerships, which are now being talked about quite a lot. And he set up the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment in 1996. So I'll give you some of the transactions, the major transactions between 1996 and 2000. BOI closed about 800 million in private-public partnership transactions, or PPP transactions. The SAGT, or the South Asia Gateway Terminal, which we know is in the Colombo port, the first private sector investment. Private power generation for the first time, totaling over 400 megawatts of thermal and 75 megawatts of mini hydro power. Again, at that time, you're talking about just before 2000. He also helped to attract competition to the fixed telephony market for this first time. So Lanka Bell and Suntel are the two mentioned. And he was also involved in privatization of Sri Lanka Telecom in 1996. Let me try and keep this short. There's so many things. Thilan also introduced several innovative investment structures. These are different structures depending on the investors who are available and who are interested into Sri Lanka's largest middle-income housing projects to date, the Millennium City, Athurugiriya, and the Nivasipura in Ekala, as well as hospitals such as the Apollo, which is now Lanka Hospitals, the Asiri Surgical Hospital, Nine Wells Hospital, and together they quadrupled the number of private hospital beds in Colombo at the time. He also played an active role in creating the Sri Lanka Institute of Information Technology, the SLIT, which is sponsoring this event as well. And it's now the largest free-living university, and he serves on the board as a life member. Going on from there, from 97 to 99, Thilan served as the founder chairman of the National Agency for PPPs, and that developed a whole pipeline of projects of over $2 billion. He resigned on policy differences in December 2019 and decided to start up his own place, which is called TWC. He's currently chairman of the TW Corp. It's an investment bank he founded 10 years ago, that is, and sits on the boards of several public and private companies. So it's engaged in a lot of the transactions that will probably become very, very significant in the next coming years. Private equity, corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, and PPP. PPP is very critical. He has also worked in the same areas in Maldives and Bangladesh, and has done some mergers and acquisitions transactions in Nepal. He is a co-founder and shareholder of several pioneering businesses, for instance, in the tourism industry, did CEYLON tea trails, Sapphirus Lanka, which is a value-added exporter of sapphires, blue sapphires from Sri Lanka, I guess, and Wow.lk, which almost of you would have heard of. It was an e-commerce company that was later sold to Dialog and now is owned by Daraz. There's another thing that I need to mention. He has now come out of retirement from cricket, I understand. So he's back in training for the over-50s World Cup in South Africa next year. So I'm sure you're going to get a very exciting address from him. And I will now leave the stage for Thilan. Thilan, please.
Is it going to come on the screen here? Or does this come on the screen here? Oh, right, okay. Principal, Ananda College, Mr. Lal Disanayaka, Vice Principal, members of the staff, President and members of the OBA, Governor Central Bank, present and old Anandians, ladies and gentlemen. Sanjeeva, thank you very much for that introduction, which was way too long. I hope I can keep everyone on their toes because mine is a relatively controversial subject that I'm talking of. Again, my appreciation to the President, Mr. Bimal Wijesinghe, and the office bearers of the OBA for inviting. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be standing on this stage. As I stand here for the first time, in fact, I want to acknowledge and pay my respects again to my late father and uncle, Dr. B.M.A. Balasurya, who were my role models as I was growing up. My mother, who is present here today, constantly watched over me and challenged me to do better in school. Former principals, in particular Colonel Rajapaksa, and the teachers, Prefect of Games, coaches, from whom I benefited tremendously in developing my leadership and communication skills, my knowledge, values, discipline, and of course, cricketing abilities. When discussing the subject matter of the speech today, I had no hesitation in picking a subject connected to the economy due to the unprecedented crisis the country is at in the moment. And I'm tackling this subject matter not as an economist. We have in the audience a governor who's far more qualified than I am, but based on my own personal experiences and analysis. For someone who enjoyed mathematics at school, I'm relying on data, thanks to the brilliant teaching of Mr. Madagama, Mr. C.M. Veeraratna. Also, this is not a speech that attempts to praise or blame any government. I've never dabbled in politics, and I do not intend on doing so either. Let me explain why I chose this title, Bridging the Ideological Divide that caused Sri Lanka's economic crisis. What's the definition of an ideology? It's a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic and/or political theory and policy. And what's a divide? It's a division. It's a rift. It's a conflict. I believe that the current economic crisis is a result of an ideology that got entrenched over decades, gradually deteriorating Sri Lanka's political culture, its institutions, fiscal discipline, transparency, and above all, the mindset of a generation. We cannot underestimate this crisis. Let me explain. In this century, only 8 countries have had sovereign defaults, including Sri Lanka. Others are Argentina, Greece, Ecuador, Venezuela, Lebanon, Zimbabwe. Not very nice company. To the best of my knowledge, Sri Lanka is the only country that waited till its usable reserves literally came to zero for less than $20 million of usable reserves at a time of declaring technical bankruptcy, despite being warned of the impending crisis for several years. And by the end of this year, due to the negative GDP growth and currency depreciation, our GDP per capita will reduce to levels that prevailed 10 years ago, translating into a catastrophic drop in living standards that will last for many years. It is therefore a crisis of unprecedented proportions, but we could have avoided this crisis if timely action was taken. I can say this unhesitatingly. There were many who warned the government on Sri Lanka's debt being unsustainable. The IMF in early 2020 and again in their debt sustainability reports in 2021 said so. International banks urged the government to take advantage of a timing opportunity in early 2020 when COVID has just spread throughout the world to restructure their debt. Rating agencies kept downgrading our international credit rating 3 times in 2020. But what did we do? We simply scolded them. Eminent economists and various think tanks warned the government of the impending doom. No action was taken. And we continue to deplete our foreign reserves. As a concerned citizen of the country, soon after COVID, I too tried to devote time of some of my team members who are some of the best financial brains in the country to make representations to the governor, to the central bank, to finance ministers. First recommendation that we made was in early 2020 to hire international debt restructuring specialists and get an independent opinion, at least to see whether our debt was sustainable. I even offered that the exporters would pay for this service if the government did not have the funds. Then I sent a note to the central bank to consider the strategy adopted by Ecuador in early 2020. It was still early days during COVID, in order to avoid a disruptive and a disorganized default. And I must show you this slide, which I had sent to the central bank, which shows that Ecuador undertook, starting in March 2020, an organized debt restructuring, where they started with an international credit rating of B-, went into an organized debt restructuring under the IMF, obtained $6.5 billion from the IMF, restructured $17 billion of debt, and restructuring, I mean extending the term, reducing the interest rate, asking for a moratorium period. And on the back of the IMF program, secured another $2 billion from Chinese banks and a further couple of $1 billion from multilaterals, and came out in 9 months with the same credit rating that it had at the beginning of the year. That is how you implement organized debt restructuring, which we failed to carry out. The government had this information in early 2020. And yet, I do not understand why the government failed to act. If it had, the impact of this crisis would not have been so severe. And I again I need to remind you of Appamado Amatapadang not being followed. Actually, my trying to make a system change to avoid this economic collapse, again, at that time as a public servant, started way back in 2019. In September 2019, I was approached by close advisors to the former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, asking whether I can meet him to advise him on what needs to be done on the economy. I refused, because I was holding public office, and it is not correct of me to meet presidential candidates. So I did the next best thing. I wrote a strategy document to both presidential candidates, Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Sajith Premadasa, giving ideas on how the economy should be carried out. And this document was called Lessons from Sri Lanka's Post-Conflict Economic Management and Action to be Taken to Enhance Economic Growth. In this report, I summarized why Sri Lanka's business rankings had gone down. Over the last 7 years, ending 2019, our economic growth was in South Asia from being the fastest. African countries were growing faster than us. The World Economic Forum downgraded our competitiveness ranking 33 positions within a period of 8 years. Our ease of doing business did not improve, whereas India increased their ease of doing business by leaps and bounds. We ranked 158th in the world in paying taxes. We had 43 different types of taxes compared to 9 or so in China and Malaysia. We ranked poorly, 163rd, behind Bhutan, Maldives, in terms of time taken to enforce contracts through courts. Then I highlighted the massive misallocation and fiscal indiscipline that prevailed in the country, where we subsidize education, health, water, electricity, kerosene, fertilizer, transport, and provide transfers through samurdhi and price control. Very little attempt was made to ensure such subsidies are properly targeted and not misallocated. Large infrastructure projects were implemented with high-cost government-backed debt without rigorous feasibility analysis and failing to yield required economic and tax returns, which became subsequently a burden on the state. High-cost unsolicited proposals became the norm rather than the exception in projects such as roads, bridges, railways, water, which were tied to high-cost debt and built-in profit margins to contractors and intermediaries, at times having profits in excess of 30%. Hardly any action was taken to stem the massive losses of state-owned enterprises, which accounted for about 3% of GDP, particularly Sri Lankan Airlines, CEB, Petroleum Corporation, Water Board. There were large revenue leakages from Inland Revenue, Customs and Excise. McKinsey, the well-known consulting company, did a quick analysis of 2 weeks and told the former Finance Minister Mangala Samarira, sir, leakages from Inland Revenue is as much as $500 million a year. So I then, in my representation, concluded, this is in 2019, that our fiscal problems are self-inflicted and is a direct consequence of out-of-control line ministries, agencies and state-owned enterprises showing little regard for fiscal discipline. Then I wanted to point out about implementation bottlenecks. We have an inherent inability to agree on a common position because we get divided with wide groups making representations, trade unions, NGOs, private companies, resulting in inconsistent and ad hoc policy making. The execution capacity of the public sector had reached paralysis levels, where a typical ministry secretary serves on 20-some committees. He hardly has time to run a ministry. Then the fragmentation of the ministries, creation of a multitude of government institutions, agencies with conflicting rules. For example, the agriculture sector is divided amongst 8, 9, 10 different ministries, making coordination impossible. So what was my recommendation? I recommended that, this was prior to the presidential election, that a National Policy Planning and Implementation Commission be set up, chaired by the President, supported by the National Planning Department and what I call a Public Investment Committee chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury, comprising Head of External Resources and Head of the PPP agency, where the optimum methods of allocating funding for investment projects is decided, with the feasibility studies being carried out by National Planning Department, supported by a secretariat to the Commission, and a legal and regulatory panel where whatever legal bottlenecks that are there to ensure that investment projects are implemented expeditiously would be handled in consultation with the Attorney General. And then what I did was, I went to the cluster principle, similar to how we run private organizations, where every possible subject pertaining to the economy, I classified into 8 clusters. And these 8 clusters are agriculture and fisheries cluster, including lands, plantation, dairy, minor export crops, etc. The private sector investment facilitation cluster, where we deal with local and foreign investment, tourism, innovation and entrepreneurship. The shipping, aviation and logistics cluster. We are simply only giving lip service to our hub strategy. We are not a hub as yet. Covering ports and airports to ensure coordination. Customs, BOI. Hydrocarbons, power, energy and minerals cluster. We as a country have billions of dollars of mineral resources which we are failing to exploit. Natural gas, phosphate, titanium, mineral sands, graphite. State enterprise and reforms and capital markets cluster to sort out the problem of SOEs. Infrastructure, housing and construction cluster, where roads, railways, bus transportation, water supply, housing development, all of which need to talk to each other, were clustered under this. Digitization and digital infrastructure cluster, to ensure customs, inland revenue, government procurement is digitized, and it is not yet done, and this is one of the causes of fiscal waste, corruption, etc. And finally, the most important, human capital and education cluster, covering state and non-state universities. Now, my vision was that the issues connected to economic development would be sorted out at the cluster level without being filtered to the president straight away, where the president would have meetings with 45 different people sitting around a table where nothing gets done. This is where the action is, where the line ministry is concerned, would deal with the cluster chairman, who the president can select, whether it's a secretary or a minister, and works towards a common economic agenda and defend any public investment project before it's put up to the cabinet. So in conclusion, I advised the 2 presidential candidates in September, October 2019 that our economy is at crossroads. The new president and government will not have the luxury of a thriving economy and will inherit an unprecedented debt burden and lack of fiscal space that will have to be addressed proactively and creatively. Now, some of these points even matter today. Traditional administrative structures and methods will not work. The public service has a leadership vacuum. And I said this note highlights an administrative structure that can tackle the most important economic and investment issues Sri Lanka will face in a systematic and structured manner, where economic management in the country will be handled by a team of highly capable people drawn from the public and private sector. And my advice to the new president was that he has to build the best economic team the country has seen. Now, this was my 2 cents worth. I said this because in Sri Lanka, we have no shortage of ideas. We are a bright people. It is just that what is good for the country either does not get done, it gets done the wrong way, or it gets ended up in a committee without any idea of how we are going to raise financing. I was then naturally delighted to read page 7 of the election manifesto of the former president, just 3 weeks after I sent this note. And this election manifesto stated, we will disband the existing National Economic Council and replace it with a National Policy Planning and Implementation Commission, functioning directly under the president to formulate national policies, etc., etc. This will ensure transparency in economic policy formulation and implementation domain. Naturally, I was thrilled. Somebody heard or somebody read my note. But what happened in reality? I have no hesitation in saying this in a public forum for the first time. The setting up of this commission, as stated in the manifesto, I have no reason to doubt that it was scuttled, it was ignored by certain high-ranking officials of the government. Had this been done, the tax cuts of December 2019, which reduced revenue to the state by almost 30%, which was done without any consultation with the finance ministry, may not have happened. Everything went downhill after that, as far as the economy was concerned and our credit rating. The PPP agency that I painstakingly set up on an honorary basis, starting in 2017, was unwound and shut down based on a misrepresentation made to the political leaders by the bureaucrats. I had raised $28 million in technical assistance funding to help implement a $3 billion PPP pipeline. 12 senior staff were trained with World Bank grant money. I resigned 2 months after this particular president got elected, hoping that the PPP agency can be saved from these bureaucrats. It wasn't. In March 2020, it was unilaterally wound up, and the $28 million lying in Sri Lanka in a bank account contributed by the World Bank went back to the World Bank. And now the government is trying to set it up again. And I'm not going to do that for the 3rd time. Then we saw further reckless behavior in January 2022, when a $500 million bond was repaid, when we had no reserves. There were winners and losers when that bond was paid. The winners were those who had the information that the bond was going to be paid and bought these bonds in the international market at few cents to the dollar, made super profits. Who were the losers? The fishermen who couldn't find kerosene or diesel to go fishing. The three-wheelers who couldn't find petrol to meet their livelihood needs. The sick who did not have enough medicine. That's how reckless we have been, but I'm not going to talk about it any further because these matters are now before the Supreme Court to figure out who and what caused the economic debacle that we are all suffering from. Then somewhere in May 2021, when the economy was well in a downward trend, I got a visit from another old Anandian and asked me what advice should I give the president. I simply said, change the economic team. Then he said, can I put it forward in a different way? I said, okay. I will present a slide presentation. I'll do a slide presentation to the president where he can understand very clearly what's going wrong with the economy. So now I would like to share with you some of these slides that two old Anandians prepared, myself and another old Anandian who's part of my team, and was sent to an old Anandian, the former president, through an old Anandian, and now it's before you a wider group of Anandians. When you look at the charts, a few charts, I'm not going to share too much with you, you will see that virtually every economic indicator of Sri Lanka was trending downward for many years, more than 10 years. Now, I wanted the former president to see in a very simple to understand presentation that Sri Lanka's economy was dying a slow death and he needed to change course. My first slide was ask the question, So the president will get a summary. How did we get to this? We grew our economy on the back of massive borrowings. We did not invest in export orientation. All our external debt did not generate sufficient foreign exchange, and we forgot about foreign direct investment. And with the GDP growing slow, there was a result of a flawed economic policy and mismanagement. And I said that COVID only made things worse. It is not the reason for the crisis. Now, the following charts are all based on central bank data, where you can see that the rate of growth after the end of the war, the 7 years from 2013 to 19, is actually lower than the period prior to the ending of the war, if you exclude the 3 years immediately after 2019, where we grew at 8 to 9% on the back of the conflict ending in 2009. But to grow at 3.9% consistently for 7 years is unacceptable, when in fact during the war years we grew at 5%. Why did this happen? We forgot about exports. The line below shows in black, as a percentage of GDP, manufactured exports from Sri Lanka, which was at 32% in 1995, and it declined to 16% by 2019. Whereas Vietnam, which started lower than us as a percentage of GDP, manufactured exports account for 80% of GDP. Let's look at foreign direct investment. Now, what matters about FDI is what the central bank defines as net FDI inflows as a percentage of GDP. Now, one would expect that net FDI inflows after the war would be higher than during the war. No, it's slightly lower. And also I want to highlight the misconceptions connected to reported FDI volumes. I remember in 2017 and 18, much was said about the highest ever level of $2 billion of FDI being attracted. Let me remind you that when FDI gets reported, 85 to 90% of that number is retained earnings reinvested by companies that are already here, not a net FDI inflow, not a net foreign investment inflow. It's rupees staying in Sri Lanka being reinvested. John Keel's Holdings, for example, is 53% owned by foreign portfolio investors and is classified as a foreign investment company. And when it bills Cinnamon Life, that gets counted as FDI. Then I looked at reserves. I warned the then president, we are the only country in the region post-COVID where reserves have declined. Mongolia increased its reserves. Pakistan, Maldives, Bangladesh, Laos. Surely there must be something wrong. Then the next slide. I draw your attention to the 2021 bar shown, where in May 2021, debt service as a percentage of loans payable in 2022 reached 131% for the first time in the history. If some of you know mathematics, it doesn't require a rocket scientist to find out why the IMF said that our debt was not sustainable. A very simple mathematical calculation would have shown in 2021 that we had no money to pay our debts in 2022. How did this happen? Look at 2009. Our total foreign debt was only 4 times our reserves. This increased to 9 times our reserves by 2020. Between 2000 and 2009, the government, state-owned enterprises, and the private sector borrowed on average $1.2 billion per annum for 10 years. That was the foreign debt borrowing. This went through the roof after 2009. Between 2010 and 2014, $22 billion was borrowed in a short period of 5 years at the rate of $4.4 billion per annum, a 400% increase. Now, we need not have worried if most of this debt was concessional. No. If you look at the early 90s, the beige chart and the green chart, 75% of our borrowings were concessional funding from multilaterals, World Bank. But by the time 2019 came, the pink chart, 52% of our borrowings were expensive commercial debt. Now, I'm not complaining about borrowing. Governments need to borrow, but it is about the type of debt and how we spend that debt that matters the most. So, in a nutshell, my final recommendations was, please, Mr. President, create the National Policy Planning and Implementation Commission. Please make use of the resources of the National Planning Department, the Finance Ministry, and the Research Department of the Central Bank to provide support to the Commission. Now, I know for a fact that this report was read by many. However, the results came too late. A few months later, I wrote another note at the urging of senior public servants in the Central Bank, Finance Ministry, who were calling me in desperation saying, we don't have a voice, the private sector, urging the government to go to the IMF. So I thought I'll write another note with a catchy political slogan, implications of an IMF program ensuring food security and social protection for low-income families. After all, that should grab someone's attention. So I said that Sri Lanka's most recent credit rating downgrade to CAA2 was a consequence of the credit rating agencies finding the so-called homegrown solution completely lacking in credibility. It can be argued that the homegrown solution of short-term fixes, such as currency swaps, mandatory forex conversions, waiting for tourism, FDI, and remittances to recover will be inadequate. The banks had to curtail their letters of credit. We were heading towards a food crisis. And then we got distracted with remittances increasing in 2020. But I argued that remittances increased in 2020 because there were so many terminations in the Middle East where one-off payments were given to pilots, to housemaids who were being laid off, and they were sending those remittances to Sri Lanka. And remittances never recovered. At the same price, oil prices were rising. So then I finally argued saying, entering into an IMF program will be painful in the short term. However, the impact on the poor of not entering into an IMF program is now higher than entering into an IMF program. And therefore, currently, and that was in September 21, the political and economic cost of not going to the IMF is higher than going to the IMF. And these reports were supported, I talked about the reliance on mathematics, by eminent economists such as Professor Premachandra Tokoral, where he argued that in high-debt countries, economies have recovered faster under an IMF program within 2 years compared to countries that did not. He also showed data that even the Sri Lankan economy under an IMF program grew faster than outside an IMF program. Now that's all about IMF, but what I've done in the first part of my speech is to have described how I, as a simple investment banker who understood a little bit about economics, had some public sector experience, spent countless hours playing my part in advising the government to take action to avoid an economic crisis, well before COVID. But I failed, and many others who were far more knowledgeable than I also failed. And how could this happen in a country with such talent? Because these views were being refuted by autocratic and politicized bureaucrats who were also stifling the views of competent state officers and external parties for making the case to the political leadership. This I know. As I mentioned earlier, I've been receiving calls from officers of the Central Bank, Finance Ministry, saying that they had no voice. And I also know that we, as concerned citizens, failed because the forces that were entrenched were too powerful. They used the power of the law and the power of their position to victimize those who opened their mouths. And that includes myself, which I'm not going to talk about. And at the root of that entrenched interest was arrogance, and yes, corruption, ignorance when you consider the fertilizer ban, and possibly geopolitics. Now, those who brought down our economy made false promises to the political leadership and faked data. Data on foreign reserves were not accurate. Then they advised the political leadership that money will come from Japan, China, from the Middle East. I knew as far back as early 2020 that we will not get 1 red cent from the Middle East, primarily because of the ban on Muslim burials during COVID. Chinese money or Japanese money that was usable did not come through. An entire nation was misled by these persons. It is without doubt that Anandians, as mentioned earlier, have excelled in every field, possibly excluding politics. We've certainly excelled in cricket, producing more test cricketers than any other school in the world, armed forces, engineering, science, economics, public service, and entrepreneurship. A lot of us have sacrificed for the sake of this country. Recently, I spent hours, countless hours, serving in a committee to restructure the power sector. But these sacrifices pale in comparison to the ultimate sacrifices made by possibly hundreds of Anandians who perished during the conflict. They died not just to liberate the North and East, but to help create an environment of peace so that we can emerge as a more prosperous nation. But those who survived the war and were protected by those who made the ultimate sacrifice let this country down. There was no one who celebrated than all of us when peace dawned in our country. We could not have predicted that in 12 short years after the war, that we would be bankrupt and become the poster child for the world on how not to manage an economy. Now, the next question I'd like to pose is, are we as a nation capable of learning and adjusting course? History does not suggest we can, unless we change the attitudes and mindset of a nation. This is the system change that we need. This is because I have hardly come across Sri Lankans asking one very important question, which I'll show in the next slide. Why did we as a country had to go begging to the IMF for bailouts and support 17 times in the last 45 years, to the point where 60% of the last 45 years we've been under an IMF program? Look at India. They went to the IMF in 1991 when they had a crisis, but never since then. We have gone 7 times since 1991, and that is because India embarked on a structural reform agenda driven by a highly competent bureaucracy and an economic team that continues to this day with minimal political interference. And this shows the period in shade that we have been under an IMF program. Now, I like to describe my next slide as what I call the unvirtuous cycle, because we seem to be repeating our mistake. So we mismanage our economy, we fail to reform, then we go to the IMF, like what we have done now. Then we blame the IMF, which is also happening now. Then we partly fix the problem. Then we abandon the IMF program and go back to economic mismanagement. This has been the unvirtuous cycle, the opposite of virtuous circle, that we have been practicing for the last 40 to 50 years. Now, isn't it time for us to stop blaming the West, China, previous governments, and COVID, and reflect on our own failures in managing our economy? On the question of what is the right economic model for Sri Lanka, I would again like to be guided by data and not dogma. Now, some say that we must do away with the Western neoliberal economic model. Some say that we must go and we must implement an import substitution strategy. Others say that we must go back to the era of Parakram Bahu when we were self-sufficient in rice. But forgetting the fact that in a small economy like ours, it is only through productivity improvements driven by trade and exports and investment that we can prosper. Now, what I would like to argue is that if we can shed this ideology that the way to economic prosperity, and this is what the data shows, is economic freedom. Let me define what economic freedom is. It is defined as the ability of individuals and families to make their own economic decisions, what to buy, whether to set up a business, where to work, whom to hire, and so on, without interference or hindrance from government or political powerful interests or of its cronies. Data shows that the drive and ingenuity of individuals and private businesses beats government planning, handouts, price controls in generating economic prosperity. Now, what are the components of economic freedom? The size of the government, taxation, I'm not going to go into detail, private property, rule of law, sound fiscal and monetary policy, trade regulations and tariffs, ease of doing business, labor and capital markets. And the results of economic freedom are quite amazing. In the bottom 25% of the least economically free nations globally, the average per capita income is only $1,300. Whereas the top 25% of the most economically free nations, the average per capita income is more than 20 times greater at $28,000 per year. Now, this is data that is presented by the Fraser Institute of Canada, which ranked Sri Lanka 89th out of 165 countries for its economic freedom. We are in the bottom half. Now, what are the top 10 countries with the greatest amount of economic freedom? In 2022, I was surprised to see Hong Kong as number one. Then comes Singapore, and we have one other Asian country, Mauritius. Now, the conclusion that I drew from this data, and I keep referring to data, is this. The key takeaway the data shows is that it is not necessarily a particular political system that generates economic prosperity, but how competently you run your government and institutions under the government. And that's what you call governance, and the degree of economic freedom. Let us look at Sri Lanka's own economic history after July 83. The longest period that we as a country did not go to the IMF was during the 7-year period from 1995 to 2001. And I would like to argue that this was a period that we followed many principles of economic freedom. Again, I want to remind this is based on data and not because that coincided almost 100% the time that I served as chairman BOI. So let me explain what I mean. Let's take the performance of the telecom sector, which was built on the principles of economic freedom. This is because the government acted as an enabler and a facilitator in the late 1990s by privatizing Sri Lanka Telecom. At that time, there was a 2.5-year period. Young Anandians would never remember this. 2.5-year period to wait for a telephone line. And the privatization proceeds were used to retire debt. I don't have data in terms of the last time that we retired debt. We brought in competition. We made computer equipment duty-free. I introduced through the BOI a 5-year tax holiday for any software business, whether export-oriented or not, including training institutions in software. We set up SLIT, which now accounts for 50% of all IT graduates, who when they graduate, starting salaries 350,000 rupees a month, 96% have job placement. We declared Malabay as an IT zone. The World Trade Center became an IT park. How did that happen? When I signed the BOI agreement with Virtusa, which today employs more than 10,000 people, they said we don't have any office space in Sri Lanka with a fiber optic backbone. I immediately went to my board, allocated funding, laid a fiber optic backbone from the top to the bottom of the World Trade Center, and that is where Virtusa started their business. And the results are there to be seen. The IT sector has been the fastest growing export sector in Sri Lanka for the last 25 years until COVID, growing at about 15 to 20% per annum, reaching over $1 billion in exports. Now, this is where the government steps in to become an enabler through the right policies and then gets out of the way, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is economic freedom. Now consider how the port of Colombo emerged as a hub, because competition was introduced for the first time through SAGT, which was backed by John Keel's and P&O and 3 other shipping lines. After competition was introduced to the port, ship waiting time reduced by 85%. That is a remarkable statistic. Port productivity improved by 65%. Now, what made us do this? We made a decision that the port must never go on strike, as it was doing very often during the 1980s. Now, after SAGT came, has the port ever succeeded in a strike? No. So what did we do? We gave economic freedom to exporters and importers. Therefore, one way of bridging the ideological divide and confusion on what a suitable economic model for Sri Lanka is to base our views on data and evidence and not ideology or populism. I would like to start with what the Buddha said. He said, you must embrace the Dhamma only after careful analysis and evaluation and not as a blind faith. By attaining a deep understanding of the Dhamma, you achieve your ultimate goal, nirvana. Now, applying this to economics, in my view, evidence-based policy making through data analysis is your Dhamma, and not blindly following the dictates of a deeply flawed political leadership as we have done for so long. Attaining a much higher ranking on economic freedom through competence governance, and that should be your nirvana in economic terms. I would like to also propose that one of the ways to bridge this ideological divide is to agree on a common economic vision for the country. And I have tried to formulate one, which is my own work. You may disagree with this. Sri Lanka shall take advantage of its location and human capital to implement a hub strategy that will foster growth in shipping, aviation, tourism, financial and digitization services, and an industrial services and agriculture policy underpinned by productivity gains and export orientation. It's very important for us as a country to have an economic vision that everyone rallies behind. Now, I'm also of the view that to bridge the ideological divide, we as a nation need a brand image, which is quite spoilt at the moment, that the world and young people can relate to. That image should reflect progressive thinking, a deep reflection of understanding of self, as the Buddha taught us. If you were to believe this doctrine, then I would argue that the country needs a new branding to dispel archaic thinking. And therefore, I propose once and for all not to call ourselves the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. We are neither socialist nor capitalist, and these are labels that have long expired. Saying that we are a democratic or a socialist is like each individual wearing a t-shirt or a headband saying we are a Sinhala Buddhist, Tamil, Hindu or Muslim. No, the ideals of our founding fathers of Ananda and us as Buddhists is that we shun such labels. Whatever label we attach to ourselves, such as Sri Lankans or human beings, should apply equally to us all. Therefore, if we are to turn a new chapter, be more appealing to the younger generation and international community, Sri Lanka needs to be rebranded as the Republic of Sri Lanka, because that is what I believe we really are. And also, in my view, the principle of economic freedom is in fact the middle path, and not socialism or capitalism, which are words that have political connotations. In my view, true socialist countries are in Scandinavia, where tax money has been used to create social safety nets. Now, there are what I call socialist basket cases: Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, that unfortunately share something with Sri Lanka now in common. And that is, I'm ashamed to say this, there are thousands who are trying to leave the shores of these countries, including ours. Now, for the benefit of young Anandians present today, I'd like to show the relationship between economic freedom and cricket. I have asked this question by many: what made us win the 1996 World Cup? People say it was Sanat Jayasuriya, Romesh Kaluvitarana's opening stand, Arjuna's leadership, etc. No. In my view, the foundation for the revival of our cricket was laid in the 1980s. But let me rewind a bit. In the 1950s to 1980s, a majority of players who represented Sri Lanka at cricket came from two schools, Royal and St. Thomas's. Anandians were discriminated against. My coach, Anuruddha Polonovita sir, had to leave his club at the urging of a selector in order to qualify to play for Sri Lanka. Then under Gamini Disanayaka, a shift happened. He democratized cricket. Any cricketer with talent had a fair opportunity to be noticed and be selected regardless of school or ethnic background. And the composition of the 96 World Cup winning team, not a single royalist or Thomian. But of course, in the same vein, I'm sad at the decline of Ananda cricket, but that's another conversation. So in my theory, The system change was the change in cricket administration. I'm now equating this to the economy. Then came meritocracy, Sudusara Tanadim, equal opportunity to be selected, regardless of your background. Then talented cricketers without means were given financial assistance. This is the only part that is socialist in my view, where you assist only the needy in a targeted way. Subsidies should not be enjoyed by all. Then came the mindset change, the crisis, like what we encountered. That mindset change happened in Australia when Muralidharan was called for no bowling. That raised the morale of the team. Then came leadership and tactics, such as the opening stands of Sanath and Kalu. And when we won the World Cup, then came the brand, where Sri Lanka cricket was recognized throughout the world. Now, can you imagine, like what happened in cricket in the late 1980s? Providing those with the ability and talent and motivation, the required tools to improve your chances of success within a given economic system. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is economic freedom. Now, there are other barriers, other ideological barriers that hold us back. Let me talk of privatization. So in the late 90s, we asked the question, can a state-owned business compete in a competitive marketplace? There was no evidence, even today, that it can. So the poster child to prove this point is Sri Lankan Airlines. The shaded portion is peacetime, where tourism took off, and also represented the exact timing with which Sri Lankan Airlines was taken over by the government. So until 2008, Sri Lankan Airlines was run by Emirates, and you hardly see any red bars going downwards. It was more or less breaking even. And then, as tourism took off, the losses increased. There's a paradox here. I don't want to go into the details where the losses came from. Now, unlike in the late 1990s, today privatization or attracting a PPP investor to lease out land or give a port terminal is referred to as a selling or vikinema. Now, that connotation is that we have lost something forever. That's what vikinema is. You sell it for a price and you've lost it forever. Now, if someone is talking of vikinema, in the same breath, I would like to talk of ugaskirima, mortgaging, and compare it with vikinema. Now, if vikinema is done correctly, the country gets an investment to an idle asset, like a land or a port terminal. The state gets upfront money when you give a land. It collects future taxes. There's technology transfer, market taxes given by the investors. Consumers are better off through competition, like what happened with telecom. Now, if we take ugaskirim, the state would give a sovereign guarantee and takes on debt. That leaves less fiscal space for education, health, and social welfare. There's an opportunity cost for that. Then, without a feasibility study, these loans are used to build assets like the Nelum Kuluna, Port of Hambantota, Mattala Airport, that hardly ever generated a financial or an economic return. Then the state pays the loan from the tax money and the forex reserves and bears the exchange loss. Consumers and taxpayers are worse off. So to me, vikinema done correctly has so much more benefits than ugaskirim. The data proves this. And still, we struggle when we talk of vikinema. Why has it become a bad word? We have embraced a wrong ideology due to a combination of political rhetoric, what I call misplaced patriotism and self-interest. For almost a generation, we glorified our country being mortgaged, mainly to private financial institutions. 53% of our total foreign debt is owed to private financial institutions on commercial terms, and forgot the benefits of a well-formulated FDI and privatizations that benefited the treasury, consumers, and investors, and of course, those who got jobs in those companies. Now, taking sovereign guaranteed loans, as I mentioned earlier, is not necessarily a bad thing, but if they're properly evaluated. Now, when you do ugaskirima in the wrong way, like Sri Lankan Airlines and Hambantota Port, you have to do a Wikinima. And the state has to take it back. Now, when Wikinima is done wrong, like what happened in the 1980s, State Hardware Corporation, Kahatagaha mines, they had to be taken back. But it is important to understand that Wikinima done better is a whole host better for consumers and everyone concerned in our economy than Ugaskirima. Proof is in the next slide, where in 2016, the Port Authority lost 7 billion rupees, the right-hand side column, mainly on account of the loan taken for the Hambantota Port. But then when you add the proceeds from the private terminals, Port Authority made a profit of 1 billion rupees. Now still people argue against the Wikinima of East Terminal. To me, the data shows that the PPP is a whole lot better than the government investing in the East Terminal. The next ideological issue that I want to talk about is about migration of talent. Now, I'm quoting here from research carried out by Professor Ricardo Hausmann, where he argued that the secret of economic growth is transfer of knowledge through mobility. Now, what does it mean? If you take Silicon Valley, almost half the Fortune 500 companies were founded by American immigrants or their children. If you take the origin of Silicon Valley, STEM workers, science, technology, engineering, and management, foreign-born workers account for 57% of Silicon Valley. Now let's look at Sri Lanka. Singapore, 46% of its workforce is foreign-born. In Hong Kong, 40% of the workforce is foreign-born. Now these are the top 2 countries for economic freedom. In Sri Lanka, less than 0.2%, or only 40,000 people. Now I'm not asking about opening the floodgates. What I'm talking about is this. For each new job created in the IT sector, 4 other local jobs are created outside the sector through multiply effect. For every foreign tourist that comes to Sri Lanka, 5 direct and indirect jobs are created. Similarly, in the US, for every foreign-born worker in the US STEM graduates, 2.6 US STEM graduates receive jobs. Now in Sri Lanka, we are a net exporter of the best brains. On average, in 2017, 23% of engineering and science graduates and 20% of computer science graduates have left Sri Lanka to work abroad. And on top of that, we make it very difficult for STEM graduates who are foreign-born to come and work in Sri Lanka. It's extremely difficult. So what results in that? This is our net migration. Now you will see that the chart to the bottom is how many people have left our shores. Then in 2014, 15, 16, 17, there was a change. There was a net inflow of qualified people to our country after the war ended. However, if you look at 22 statistics, I'm sure this is reversed. So what should Sri Lanka do to move forward? The country and the government will need to open up for more inflow of know-how, the way all prosperous countries have done. In Thailand, for example, a foreigner receives a 10-year residence visa if he generates only 4 Thai jobs. In India, the IT revolution in the early 1990s started with Indian immigrants who went to the US who came back with access to markets and investment. So therefore, we as a country need to shed this ideology of fearing competition. More FDI, more brain power needs to be attracted to complement and to counter the exodus of brain power from our country. Now, I have been asked by some, what aspects have contributed to my growth as a leader? It's simply diffusion through mobility. Asia Capital, for example, was the first financial services company to give a minority stake to a foreign investment bank. We were the first financial services company where the two founders who ran the business, myself and my colleague, we stepped down and hired an Englishman as the CEO because we felt that we can gain from his knowledge from London, which was the financial center at that time. Now, I learned to compete internationally, not merely by getting a deal based on who I know, but based on self-improvement. So it is this competition and not handouts that enhances your skills, whether you are an individual or a business. The same applies to trade. This is an important point for everyone to know when we shed our archaic ideologies. Now, we call ourselves a hub nation. We want to become a shipping and aviation hub. But let's look at the data. Trade as a percentage of GDP is going in the wrong direction. Trade as a percentage of GDP is import and exports as a percentage of GDP has gone down from 42% to 43% over the last 25 years, whereas in Vietnam it has increased from the same levels that we had in the 1990s to 181%, Thailand 117%, and Singapore 338% of GDP is trade, because it's a hub nation, it's a trading nation, it is also a manufacturing nation. Manufacturing requires imports, because that's what we call a global value chain. Increasingly, imported goods are required to manufacture finished goods. And then we complain about not having enough. We complain about free trade agreements. We have the lowest number of free trade agreements compared to our neighbors. Republic of Korea has 16, India has 13. We have only 2 or 3 that are actually operational out of the 5. Now let us look at the data again to get over this phobia of free trade agreements that are negotiated properly. They have to be negotiated properly. What does the data reveal in terms of the Indo-Lanka free trade agreement? Now, the agreement was signed in 2000. Our exports in 5 years, up to 2005, grew by 10-fold, 1,000% in 5 years. And 97% of our exports were under the preferential tariff items. Whereas, when India exported to us, to Sri Lanka, only 18% came under preferential tariff items. Tata buses, Maruti cars were not part of the preferential tariff agreement. Full duty had to be paid. That came outside the preferential tariff items. So if you look at trade under the preferential tariff items, Sri Lanka often runs a surplus with India. That is how you negotiate free trade agreements. And the success that this free trade agreement, you have to only consider Damro or Siet, which have generated much exports for Sri Lanka. Now this is the final part of my speech. My apologies for taking so long. Now, I'd like to quote some history. Over the last few decades, Sri Lanka has been subject to a culture of dependency and servitude. For example, a dependency on politicians for jobs and handouts, when in fact the job of a politician is to set the policies that would generate the jobs and through productive investments. State enterprises are being used as job banks. There's an unholy rent-seeking nexus between certain elements of the private sector and the government that results in lost tax revenue, corruption, wasted resources, and a mountain of debt. Above all, Sri Lanka has suppressed the voices of reason while embracing an economic ideology and dogma propagated by a political class that created this culture of dependency, perpetuated by a few bureaucrats who themselves failed in their duty in providing the correct advice to the ruling class and therefore served their masters and themselves and not the country. From 1995 to 2001, and this is the only name I'm going to mention in my speech, we had no reason to go to the IMF because of the bureaucratic leadership given by probably one of the best Secretary of the Treasury and governors I have worked with, Mr. S. Jayawardena. He played a role in changing the economic ideology of Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga from left-leaning ideology to a more centrist platform that I have defined in this oration as economic freedom. Before I end my speech, I would like to go back further in history, 175 to 200 years. when there was a situation that was mentioned earlier where Buddhism was threatened. Now, to quote from Sanjeeva's Olcott Oration in 2014, it says, "For a period of almost 200 years, Buddhism was in decline in the absence of royal patronage, with rulers being preoccupied with survival." Now today, our country's economy has hit rock bottom, becoming the first country in Asia for 50 years to declare bankruptcy, when in fact, we are at the center of one of the world's fastest growing regions, led by India, Bangladesh, Maldives, and Bhutan. And this is also a result of our rulers being preoccupied with survival. And at the same time, we have weakened and politicized the key institutions that could have helped us in this crisis, the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. Therefore, it is my view that the time has emerged for a new force, similar to when Venerable Mohotivatte Gunananda Thera emerged to challenge the Christians to defend their faith via a series of debates. The first at Uyanvita, then Gampola, and finally, 1873, the Panaduravada. Now, the impact of that debate was remarkable, both locally and internationally. There was a book published by Mr. J.M. Peebles in the US in 1878, based on these debates, called Buddhism and Christianity Face to Face. Now, it is after reading a copy of this book that Henry Steel Olcott, our founder, came to Sri Lanka in 1880. Now, with the arrival of Colonel Olcott, the Buddhist revival movement accelerated, as pointed out by other orators today, and he described Venerable Mohotivatte Gunananda as, to quote, "the most brilliant polemic orator of the island. He is the terror of missionaries, with a very intellectual head, and the most brilliant and powerful champion of Buddhism. Even those of the Christian faith praised Gunananda Thera." Therefore, it is now time for our country to produce the equivalents of the Venerable Mohotivatte Gunananda Thera and Henry Steel Olcott, and embrace their approach to build strength in numbers. One individual cannot do this. To lead the revival of an economy that is built on consistent and evidence-based principles, with independence of institutions in charge of the economy protected, and the dignity of the public service revived. I urge Anandians to play a catalytic role in facilitating this change. Our very future depends on it, and the changes required for our economic revival must be institutionalized and legislated in order to instill discipline in the system. Else we will not gain credibility as a nation and will forever be coming in and out of wildly fluctuating economic cycles characterized in the last 50 years. I would like Anandians to form the equivalent of a Theosophical Society for the revival of the economy. The Theosophical Society's founding principles were laudable. A center for strengthening of universal brotherhood without distinction of race, religion, sex, caste, or color, and to encourage the study of comparative religions, philosophy, and science. So similarly, for the economy, we would need to have a series of debates or roundtables that we as Anandians can organize, similar to the Panaduravada, where we can compare with data comparative economic systems. We can promote progressive ideas and to seek to educate, change attitudes, dispel economic myths. We need to engage with economic thinkers of all parties, including some parts of the radicalized youth movements, in order to generate a consensus on reforms. We need to ensure that entrepreneurship is nurtured at every level. Also, my earlier suggestion of setting up a National Policy Planning and Implementation Commission is just one such idea, which also needs to be debated. Maybe others have better ideas. But at this moment, sadly, there's too much of a divide between the ideologies of politicians, the private sector, special interest groups, trade unions, and the student movement. We need a force of unity that can at least narrow these differences. This needs to happen yesterday. And we as Anandians can be the agents of change, I believe. Can this change also include every student at Ananda being taught basic economics and finance so that they have a deeper understanding of the issues that caused our country's economic downturn, and therefore a mindset change can happen at a very young age. I'm deeply disturbed as a citizen of the country, seeing self-interest prevailing over the interests of the country. This has resulted in a breakdown in our value system and people not having faith or trust in Parliament or the institutions. Now, history reminds us that dictators and despots arise during times of severe economic crisis. Now, I don't want that to happen in our country. And if we as Anandians can take action to bridge this ideological and ethical divide that caused this economic crisis, I'm willing to assist in any way which I can, because the future of this country depends on it. And finally, a quote by Mr. VTS Sivagurunathan, a product of Jaffna Hindu College and a teacher and a headmaster at Ananda for 25 years. This is what he said in 1958, and thanks again, Sanjeev, for highlighting this quote. And may I remind you all that you are one and all the proud inheritors of a sacred trust. And it is for you and me to see that Ananda does not become a lifeless state school, is not satisfied with being merely a Sinhala Buddhist school, but grows into a greater and greater Ananda, so that it may continue to be the hub of all national education activities, the hub of the Commonwealth of the Ceylonese people of Lanka. Surely, Ananda can also become the hub of modern, progressive economic thinking to change attitudes and values of a whole people and a whole country. I would like to live in that hope for the rest of my days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, for explaining to us the cost of human error in the blunders and short-sightedness of economic policy making in the country, and how now more than ever we need change makers. Not just change makers, but change makers with progressive attitudes to take charge of this country and take charge of this world in the next few years. While I extend my warmest gratitude to Mr. Wijesinghe, I'd like to ask our head table to just rise and join me in presenting a special token of gratitude to our orator, Chief Guest Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, for gracing this occasion and actually making an impact in terms of what the country can do in the next few years, especially taking the onus. The young Anandians who are here, so much for you to learn from what Mr. Wijesinghe had to offer. Thank you very much, Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, for sparing the time and being here with us this evening. He is being presented with this memento by the Principal of Ananda College, Mr. Lal Disanayake. Thank you very much. We've also got a special small magazine that we'd like to release today. The Ananda magazine will also be released today. A newer edition, unlike the previous ones we have released. And this time, the Old Boys Association has opted to release the hard copy together with a special virtual copy of the Ananda newspaper, which is being presented to our orator and Chief Guest Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe by the Chairman of the Olcott Oration 2022 Committee, Mr. Samitha Seneviratne. The speciality of this year's release is that the OBA has taken upon itself to minimize the waste of paper, a sustainable approach to adapt to the new technology, a new concept using a QR code, using which you can access a PDF version of this Ananda magazine, this edition, and also you yourselves can grab a copy while you're making your way out of the auditorium. And there's also access to special interviews and all kinds of live interviews that were done throughout the course of preparing content for this magazine. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. On that note, I believe we've almost reached the end of this evening's proceedings, but to extend gratitude to the entire organizing committee and each and every individual who played a major role in making sure that this year's Olcott Oration went off fabulously well, I'd like to invite the chairman of the Olcott Oration 2022's organizing committee, Mr. Samitha Seniviratna, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening. Let me start off my vote of thanks with a quote that I've got from His Holiness Dalai Lama, which goes in line with the situation, the function today. When you practice gratefulness, there's a sense of respect towards others. Members of the head table, distinguished members in the audience, other distinguished members who are joining us live via our streaming program, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very humble and honored to be the one making the closing remarks and propose the vote of thanks in the presence of a distinguished and intellectually stimulating gathering, both in person here and joining live through streaming. On behalf of the Ananda College All Boys Association, would like to pay the most respected gratitude for the Venerable Thero for conducting the religious activities at the start of these proceedings. True to its meaning, we have just witnessed the Olcott Oration 2022 delivered by Thilan Wijesinghe on a very timely and an interesting topic which perhaps would have generated stemming ideologies in order to address the situation in a more pragmatic manner. However, I for one think for a moment that there were square cuts, back foot defenses, and of course at times some hook shots coming out his DNA being a cricketer. Akoba would like to also express sincere appreciations for having accepted our invitation very humbly and also in honoring the same with lots of facts and figures and giving out what's needed to be done at the hour of need. Also, it goes without saying that a special thanks goes to Mrs. Wijesinghe and the son who are here today with us to witness and support the event. Thank you very much for being here. Although this oration is typically organized by the Ananda College All Boys Association by spearheading all the activities, we have always looked upon to the guidance and assistance extended by the present leader of our alma mater, Mr. Lal Disanaika. Thank you, sir, for all what you have done in various ways to make this a glamorous event as well. In the same token, it goes on to express our gratitude for the assistance and the support given at various levels by the deputy principals, members of the school management, tutorial staff, also to make these events a success. Thank you for all. Needless to say that an event of this magnitude needs the support and dedication and even assistance where needed of many. So I personally would like to thank the Executive President, Bimal Wijesinghe, and the members of my management committee for their collaborative support given from their respective levels to make this flagship event more colorful and meaningful. While recalling the services of and the contributions extended during their times, I would be failing at this moment if I overlook the guidance and support given at times by our past presidents. And I personally extend heartfelt gratitude for being here and gracing the occasion as well. A special thank goes to the members of the EXCO, members of the local and overseas affiliated groups of Ananda College All Boys Association for having supported this flagship event in numerous ways, which otherwise wouldn't have been so easy. So thank you all being here and listening and watching us live from various parts of the world. At this point, it is nothing but prudent to mention two entities, both the Sri Lanka Institute of Information Technology and the Mulberry Apartments for their generous contributions to mitigate significant amount of expenses of this event. And on behalf of the ECOBA, I sincerely thank them as well. Also, ECOBA would also thank the members of the STS for gracing this occasion here and also for their assistance from time to time to make this event again a very successful event as well. The members of the OBA admin office and the staff of Kulratna Auditorium have also been instrumental in deliberating this event and would like to thank them personally for their contributions at this moment as well. We always cherish and remember the presence of members of OGAs and OBAs of our fraternity. And some members are already present here with us today as well. So thank you very much for being and gracing the occasion. ACOB also recognizes the presence of the members of the Prefect Board at this flagship event. And a special thank goes to them as well on our behalf. There are many service providers giving us their expertise to make this event glamorous, memorable, and of course a real-time continuous event by way of devoting their skills and time with the new technology. ACOBA would like to thank them for all those things being done at this moment. A special appreciation goes to our own Gamini Jayaratna for having generously sponsoring the floral arrangements of the day you would see here. A flow of this event has been managed and delivered with high level of standard by our vibrant compeer today, Thilan Udayaratna, and on behalf of the Ananda College All Boys Association, would like to thank him for his devotion and accepting our invitation as well. Like in the past, we have been able to get pre-event publicity through electronic and print media under hard times, of course, and we thank all of them for having contributed for a worthy cause at all times. But having said all that, one would need an able, dedicated, and a responsible team to deliver the various tasks in organizing an event of this caliber, who are working day in and day out, and even now behind the screen, and even outside the auditorium. So there goes my special thanks to each and every member of my subcommittee, including the invited members, for having devoted their time and energy to make this event a success at this time. As a final remark, I sincerely regret on behalf of the Ananda College All Boys Association if I miss out any institute or any person connected with this event in my vote of thanks, which is not a deliberation, but only an oversight. Finally, I wholeheartedly thank each one of you for being here in person and also joining through the live streaming, for having devoted your time to respect our founders and also to show the solidarity with Ananda College All Boys Association. May the blessings of Ananda Mata be with you at all times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seneviratna. That pretty much sums up this evening's proceedings. Once again, thank you very much to all of you for joining with us this evening in person, and to all those joining our live stream virtually. It's truly been a pleasure, and thank you very much to Mr. Thilan Wijesinghe, the principal, and all our members joining with us this evening, staff members. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be your MC this evening. It's been a pleasure as always. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We've got food and beverages laid outside at the lobby of the Satmahala building for you, so please do indulge yourselves. And on that note, thank you very much once again, and have a great evening.